Next, State Representative Robert Martwick delivers an address and later takes questions on the several proposals to reduce the state's pension debt and how politics have so far prevented a solution. This runs about 40 minutes.
Good morning, everyone. That's pretty good. We can do better. Good morning.
Good morning.
There we go. That's better. Okay. I just made the 3-hour drive down from Chicago, so I need a little bit of good energy coming back from you, okay? So thank you, Linda, for that very kind introduction. It's interesting as she was talking about me. Do you ever find yourself at a place in your life and wonder, how did I get here? Right? And I had served in local elected office. I had sought higher office and lost. And I got to a point where I was 45 years old and I was getting married. And I'd said, that's enough. No more elected office. I want to focus on getting married. And so I did. I got married, and for about 3 months I came home. And I remember I would come home from work as an attorney, and I would see my wife and I would say, what do you want to do for dinner? And then what do you want to do later? And what would you like to do this weekend? You know, and about 3 months after I got married, I was approached by my predecessor, and he said, Rob, I'm retiring from the state legislature and I'd like you to run for my seat. And I said to him, and this is as honest truth, I looked at him, and he was a good friend. I looked him, we're having coffee, and I looked him in the eye and I said, well, you're a rotten SOB, you know that? And he said, well, it's not really what I was expecting. And I said, well, Joe, I said, I told my wife I was going to retire to spend more time at home and just have a regular life. And he said, well, it's up to you. And I went home and I talked to my wife, and I took the weekend, and we had these long conversations about, this is something I always wanted to do, is serve in the legislature. Should I do this at this point in my life? And she encouraged me to. She said, do it. She said, but you know what? Do it right. You weren't ever going to serve again. So go and serve like it doesn't matter if you ever get another term. And that sort of guided my whole, what Linda said about straight talk, common sense solutions. I tell people the truth when that's not really a good thing for me to do. And because if we don't acknowledge the nature of our problems, we'll never solve them. I've had many discussions with my colleagues in the House where whatever your politics are, right, it's irrelevant really. I'm a Democrat, and I actually proposed a bill that would have, you know, it's a very hot topic these days, that would have imposed or would have allowed a graduated income tax rate structure, and I actually filed rates that everyone screams about. Where are your rates? And then I filed my rates, and they said, look at his terrible rates, right? And to much fanfare, my friends on the Republican side of the aisle all signed a resolution that said, absolutely not, we won't even consider it. And I remember having a conversation with one of them, and I say this, one of my dear friends, and he said, Rob, I saw what you filed. And he said, but I just can't. I cannot agree to graduated rates. I'm just fundamentally opposed to them. And I said to that dear friend of mine, I said, that's okay. That's okay. I mean, we all come with different ideas on how to solve problems. You can have different ideas than me, but do you know what the math is of our problem? He goes, I know it's terrible. I said, that's not what I asked. I said, do you know the math of our problem? Do you know the financial projections of the next 27 years? Do you know what our cumulative budget shortfall is? Do you know what our actual taxes, not what we assess, not what we collect, but what we're structurally running our government at, right? Because if you don't know those numbers, how can we argue about the best way to solve them? And so that's been sort of my mantra, right? As I go around my district, the last 2 nights we've had speaking engagements at local organizations in my district, and people have said, well, what happened in Springfield? And they're expecting all sunny and cheery news because we passed a budget. And I go, that's great. But, right, we've got a problem that's still coming down the hill. And as many of you know, our financial condition is tied to the condition of our pension systems. It really is. I mean, yes, there are other pieces we can move around in state government, but the bottom line is this is what's going to drive our finances for the next 27 years as we make the payments on this ramp. So you talk about finding yourself in odd places. I ran for the legislature, and when I started out, I really didn't know what I wanted to get into, but I'd served as a local elected official, but I was not a pensioner. I was not going to get a pension for anything, and I came to the legislature, and of course pensions were all the issue. I came in 2013, and we were about to pass SB 1, the big initiative, right? Was it SB 1 or was it going to be 2404? What are we going to do? And I remember the night before the vote on SB 1, I received 5 calls from Speaker Madigan telling me that I had to vote for this bill. Now, I was a freshman legislator, and 5 times I said, I'm not going to, but you have to, but I'm not going to. And it was very uncomfortable. We had a lot of discussion, but as I went through that whole process leading up to the vote on SB 1, I saw, to me as a lawyer, what appeared to be clearly unconstitutional. But not only that, something that I thought was just morally wrong. You make a promise, you deliver on the promise, especially when it comes to retirement savings. We would never in the the private sector, think that we could go back on retirement savings. We would never say, I know we've been putting all that money in the 401k for you, but you know, things are tight, so we're going to take some away. Wouldn't do that, right? And so I was a believer that initiative was wrong. I voted against it. As it turned out, it was the wrong thing to do, and we've been given a clear directive by the Illinois Supreme Court about what we can and cannot do. But I was not a pension committee member. I didn't serve on the pension committee. I did my best to educate myself about that bill, to really understand the greater problem. I was a freshman. This is very big. It wasn't a matter that I had ever dealt with in my private life. And now we're moving forward. I come back for my second term, and I'm not on the pension committee. I don't serve on the pension committee. But Governor Rauner, in my second term, takes office, and he immediately proposes his pension plan. And I said, well, maybe I'll go sit in on the pension committee and hear what he has to say. Hear what his staff is going to talk about his pension plan. And I sat there, and you're always welcome to sit on a committee even if you're not a member. And I sat and I started asking questions because I found his plan interesting. I didn't find it to be legal. And of course, as we all know, it didn't go anywhere. And I think that by and large, even people who might publicly support it, a lot of them would agree, probably not constitutional, right? So good politics for that part of the society that wants those changes, but not actually good policy because it probably would do nothing to solve our financial problem and it would just waste more time. So I asked a lot of questions. I would come in, I would sit in my predecessor as chair of the pensions would acknowledge me, and she would allow me to ask questions even though I wasn't a member of the committee. Then they would start, other members of the committee would start saying, well, he's here. Can I go do something else? Can you sub me off and just put him on the committee? And I started getting subbed onto the committee, which I said, well, I don't care, you know. And so your third term, I get reelected in my third term, January of 2017, I get a call from the speaker and he says, I would like you to be the chairman of pensions. And I said, I've never even served on pensions. He said, I understand that, but this is a decision that we've made. We'd like you to accept this responsibility. Will you do it? And I thought to myself, am I being punished for doing a good job? And it has been interesting. And so my very first year, I took the approach of, okay, I'm really not well versed in this. And this is really important to what goes on in the state of Illinois. Rob, just don't screw it up. So I took a stewardship role. I said, let me just make sure that there aren't, exercising my powers as chairman, make sure that bad bills don't get pushed through, and the bills that are important do make their way through the committee. But I will tell you, I did not take a whole lot of initiative because I felt I had to get up to speed on the learning curve. But the more I began to learn about it, the more I realized that since SB 1 failed and the Supreme Court made its decision, we really have done very little to address the pension problem. And the pension problem is no longer a problem of do Tier 1 retirees deserve their benefits or not? That question has been decided, and the answer is an emphatic yes, and they're going to get them. And the pension problem has thus become a financial problem. How do we manage the repayment of our debt? And so between my first year as chairman of pensions and this last year, I spent a lot of time working with my committee staff to start to explore ways that we could manage the repayment of the debt constitutionally without diminishing the benefits that we owe to our retirees. And it was during that time that I was approached by John Carr and Linda Brookhart, and we began to discuss this concept of bonding the unfunded liability. And they brought a wonderful professor, Professor Ron Fang, and correct me if I'm wrong, the head of actuarial sciences at the University of Illinois, who worked up a mathematical model that makes perfect sense. When you look at the math, there's no reason you would not do this mathematically. And so I looked at it and I said, this makes perfect sense. We should do this. And we worked on it, we tweaked it, we looked at political realities, we changed some assumptions to make things more workable, and finally we decided we would sit down and we would have a subject matter hearing on it. Well, I will tell you that the reception by the financial community was less than warm. Okay? And that's okay. That's their job. And I don't think that they were wrong, because despite the fact that the math makes perfect sense, the other variable is that the state of Illinois has for decades ignored its pension problems, has done nothing to address them, and as a result has the worst credit rating in the country. On top of that, right at the time that we're doing this, you had 3 years of budget stalemate where we were not even operating our government. Okay? So much of our government, we all know about funding for higher education, what happened during the last 3 years, right? So we're not even operating a functioning government. And the financial community just said to us, sorry, see, here's the thing. While it makes mathematical sense, you need buyers, and we don't trust you. And so I said, okay, this makes sense, but in order to accomplish this, in whole or perhaps in part, we need to begin to restore confidence in the state of Illinois. I'm happy to say that a bipartisan agreement on a budget is a good step forward, right? So what we did in May is a good step forward. Again, it does nothing to address our long-term problems, but hey, one step at a time. So we held subject matter hearings on a whole bevy of pension ideas. Downstate police and fire consolidation, I don't know how many of you know this, are each downstate, and I say downstate, I mean other than the city of Chicago, right? That's how we did, well, and for these funds, that's how they define it. I understand that's not the case, but what they call downstate police and fire funds are all fire and police funds outside of the city of Chicago. There are 687 of them in the state of Illinois. Each town has its own pension system. Each fire protection district, right? So there are 687 of these little pension funds. Some of them, town of Aurora, quite big. Some of them, little municipality has one full-time police officer, the fire chief, and they have a pension system for him. Okay? So we're looking at ways of using some sort of consolidation, be it governance of these funds to make it more like an IMRF style, or perhaps if governance isn't palatable, if they want local control, then perhaps giving them some sort of consolidated financial authority so that they can pool their assets for better returns. The more assets you have, the more you can leverage the markets. So we're looking at that. We began subject matter hearings on that. We did not do anything with it, but we began the discussion to show the financial world that, hey, we're looking into solutions to our problems. not just the one solution that will solve it all, because as we all know, that's not out there, but instead, what can we do to nibble around the edges to find this? I'm happy to say that something did make it into our bill. One of the subject matter hearings that we had was an idea that I actually came up with before I was on the pension committee, and I had approached Elaine Neckrits, but at the time, the feeling was we had to have that silver bullet solution, one solution that solves the problem. And so when I said, well, how about if we offered completely optional, discounted present cash value buyouts to a certain amount of an annuity, and they could choose it or not choose it as their situation sees fit? And she said, that's not going to solve the problem. It would help, but it's not going to solve the problem. So we didn't even look at it. But then a friend of mine, a Republican, Mark Batnick, had simultaneously had a very similar idea, and we started talking. And he said, hey, I've got an idea. And I said, I've got an idea. And he said, well, why don't you file a bill and I'll be your chief co-sponsor? And I said, nah, that's what everybody expects. Let's really show bipartisanship. I said, you file the bill, Mark, and I'll be your chief co. And he was like, really? And I said, absolutely, let's do this. And we did it. This was 2 years ago. It never went anywhere. But then we reintroduced it this year. And so his bill was vested inactives, right? So those people who worked a few years, long enough to vest in Tier 1, but they've long since moved on and have other employment and other savings, offered to buy them completely out of their annuities, right? My bill was the one that would allow you, if you're entitled to a 3% compounding COLA, to sell a portion of your COLA. So you would give up your 3% compounding in exchange for 1.5% simple, which has historically been the rate of inflation. In exchange, you would get a buyout of cash up front. This was attached to the budget. It's optional. You don't have to take it if you don't want. It might make sense for you. Do you have children or grandchildren with a disability? You could pull that COLA forward, put that money in a 529 account to provide for their care, right? Perhaps you did well throughout your career and you have all sorts of other savings, and you say, why do I want to wait for this money? I'll pull this money forward and use it on something I want today. Entirely up to you. You might say, heck no, I'm not giving up my protection. I want my COLA. Well, you keep it. I'm happy to say that Moody's rated our pension buyout plan as credit positive. So they have said, Illinois did something right. We like that. And that's what I was trying to accomplish. Thank you. So the really good thing about this is that we actually were able to, and this was part of, I was involved. I'll give you a little inside, the inside story here. So I get invited to a budget negotiation hearing when we're actually talking about the budget. I was like, wow. So I go to this hearing, and it's members of all four caucuses, staff from all four caucuses, and the governor's budget team. And they want to talk about pensions. And the reality of it is that there was really nobody in the room who understood pensions. And so they're all kind of looking around with glazed eyes going, And the governor's staff is talking, and they're like, oh, we really like this idea of discounted buyouts. And I said, which model? And they said, what do you mean? I said, well, you can buy out a lot of things. What are you looking at? And they said, well, we're looking at vested inactives. And I said, how about COLA? Hey, what? I said, well, how about if you offer a COLA buyout from a compound to a simple? And I went, oh, the lights went off. They went, oh, that would save us a lot of money. I said, it would, depending on how many people take it. And so they went and they put in projections. They projected about $500 million of annual savings. Will it be $500 million of annual savings? I don't know. And the truth is, I'm not really concerned about it, right? I mean, we do a lot of projecting in Illinois. We've been projecting that we're going to get $300 million in revenue from the sale of the Thompson Center for the last 3 years, right? So there is budget gimmickry. The thing is that I know it will save money, and I believe that the more that that people are aware that it's out there, the more that we will get people to, the higher their participation, the more we save. But here's the best part about it. is that we're not taking fund assets. Now think about this, right? I mean, we're all a group of state university annuitants, so I don't have to explain this too much. But even if we used fund assets, everyone who opts into this, by virtue of the fact that it's a discount, makes the fund's overall balance better, right? 70%. I'm buying you out of your whatever your COLA is worth at 70% of its value. If you choose to take that, well, you've just made the balance better. But I have to sell assets, I have to deplete assets to get there. It's not ideal. It would be ideal if we were at 75% funded, not at 40% funded, right? So what we did was, and this is bringing this around, we brought in the concept of bonding that we talked about, how using bonding can save us money, right? So what we did was we authorized $1 billion a year of bonding to pay for discounted buyouts. But the repayment of that bonds does not come from the pension funds. It comes from general revenue. So in a sense, what that's like doing is for each of those buyouts that are taken, it's like we're putting money into the fund. So, right, because we're removing assets with general revenue, we're paying for the removal of liabilities with general assets without depleting the fund level. So each person who takes that will start to improve the funding levels of the pension system. And I think once that happens, that will even create greater confidence, and we will have more options to go forward on finding ways to pensions. I don't know how much I know you have a big conference here, but let me put the numbers in perspective for you, okay? When I talked about those projections that I've worked with COGFA to get, over the course of the next 27 years, if we remain with a 4.95% flat tax, and we make just the minimum pension payment as required by the ramp, okay, which is, I know that sounds like, oh, well, of course you're going to do that. And thankfully, we're at a place where we say, well, of course we're going to do that. But as we know, it's not too long ago that we said, no, we'll just skip it this year, right? Okay, so we're past that point. But if we make the minimum payment as required by the ramp, and then we also did this, is everyone aware that we did this education, K-12 education funding reform, much heralded bipartisan measure that we've all celebrated, which is to create more equity in education. Well, that requires a commitment, right? That's an additional $350 million per year additional every year until over the course of 10 years, we've added another $3.5 billion to spending on education. So I said to COGFA, over the course of the ramp, if we make every payment, we increase funding by the $3.5 billion to education, and then all other state spending grows at its 20-year historical rate, which, because of the pension problems, all other state funding, absent pensions, has been very flat in Illinois, okay? It hasn't had exceptional growth. Case in point, spending on higher education, okay? So assume historical average, we're not talking about a lot of spending. And I said, over the course of that next 27 years, where will we fall with that 4.95%? Do we have enough money to balance our budgets? They said, no. I said, okay, how much do we fall short? And they said, $224 billion over the course of the next 27 years. And I said, holy mother of God, what tax rate would we need if we maintain a flat tax structure to balance our budgets over the next 27 years? They said 6.45% flat as of January 1st, 2019. And, by the way, just an aside, what are the chances that we'll have a 6.45% flat rate by January 1st, 2019? And the answer is 0. Yes, right? It's just not going to happen. But they said every year that you delay necessitates the need for a higher and higher and higher flat rate. Folks, we are on track if we do what Illinois has done, where all we do is focus on, did we pass a budget today? Oh, good, we can go home for the summer. If we keep doing that, we are on track to a 7.5%, 8.5% flat rate that will be needed in future generations. Now, here's the question. Will we pass that rate? No, we will not. No one will vote for a 7.5%, 8%, 8.5% flat rate. So what will we do? We will stop putting money into the pensions. We will cut funding for higher education. We will cut funding for K through 12 education. We will cut in-home care for senior citizens and people living with disabilities. We will eliminate child care assistance for single working mothers. Okay, everything we did during the budget impasse, it's all coming back if we don't do something about the problem. And so my focus as we go forward, that's the truth part that doesn't get me reelected, by the way. My focus is been and will continue to be putting these financial problems that the state faces out there, right? Because we have commitments that we have to live up to, and we have to find answers to our problems, but we will not find the answers to the problems if we don't at least acknowledge, and again, let me point this out for you. This is not Democratic math, and it's not Republican math. It's just math, okay? When we acknowledge that problem, then we can sit down and we can have the partisan discussions about the best way and the best ideas to solve those problems. They're all on the table for me. Regardless of my political affiliation, every option is on the table to solve this problem because I don't want to see us make this situation worse for the next generation. Here's the good news. The good news is we can mathematically solve this problem. Okay, mathematically, Professor Fang and SUAA came to me with a solution to help us save $100 billion over the course of the next 27 years and solve our problem, right? Mathematically, I came up with a graduated rate structure, which, while not ideal, acknowledges the reality of our problems and solves it. I'm not saying that mine is the right answer. I'm not saying that Professor Feng's is the right answer. But if we can come to the table in a bipartisan fashion and sit down, we can begin addressing these. And of course, focusing on how we can do constitutional solutions to the pension problem that look at the pension problem as a debt repayment plan and not as a way to strip away promised benefits to retirees who have paid for them and earned them. I think that that's the way that we will find our solutions, and that's what I'm committed to working on over the course of the next 2 years, if my voters see fit to send me back. And given the way I talk, that's questionable at this point. So, but it's been a pleasure to work with SUAA. The people that you have that are representing you in Springfield, I will tell you, are the best. They come with that approach of that we share that same approach of let's find solutions to our problems. And they're doing it with your best interest at heart. So it is great to work with your organization. You will always have an open door and an open ear, most importantly, in my office, and I look forward to working with you in the future. So thank you, everyone, for your time and your attention today. Thank you. The question, in case you didn't hear, was what can you as educators do? And the answer is quite simple, and I already gave it away. Educate. And I'm not kidding, right? People don't understand the nature of the problems that go on. They understand as much as they hear, and most, unfortunately, what we hear has a partisan bend to it, or someone has an ulterior motive. Educate people about the nature of our problems. You know, one of the things I tell people is, as they fight against the 4.95% flat tax, they fight against the progressive tax, I tell them, we're running our government at 6.45%. That's what we're doing. We're only collecting 4.95%. What we're doing is we're taking the last 1.5% and we're running it on a Visa. And you're going to pay it back in the future with 27% interest. I mean, it's really no better than that. So again, as educators, educate people, you know, whatever medium you have at your disposal. If it's social media, great. If it's neighborhood groups, great. If it's associations like this where you reach out and talk to other people, educate them about the nature of our problems. Again, solutions will only come when we acknowledge the math of the problem, and no one is better equipped to tell people what that is than all of you. Anything else, or? Yes, sir.
John?
My name is John Easter, I'm from NIU, and I'm also a trustee of CSRS. I have a question about the buyout and the way I'm wondering if it's going to help our CSRS balance. I think I heard you say it. But as I understand it, there's also a provision that we have really isn't going to help our balance, but it's going to help the state. Help the state break even.
Well, there is going to be a recertification. One of the things that I fought for was they were trying to recertify based upon prior assumptions. And one of the things that I demanded was that if we're going to do recertification, it should be done on the newer assumptions, which of course then that will create a higher payment, not a lower payment. This is a lot of the issues that have been done they continue to be sort of, what can I do to get out of my budget problem today? Because I don't want any more cuts and I don't want to raise any more taxes. So how do I kick the can down the road a little bit more? So that was one way we put a stop to that. So there will be a recertification, but it's going to be based on how many people accept this. It's not going to be based on a prediction. So it will be actual numbers, and it will be based on lower assumed rates of return, not the higher ones that were used previously. So that is good news in that respect. Yes. Anything else? Yes, sir.
What would suggest the graduate tax increment numbers you were looking at?
So there's much talk about what should the rate structure be. I will tell you that there was proposed once, and I, it's great for politics, but it's nonsense, and so I say it's nonsense. There have been rate structures proposed by Democrats who want to see graduated rates where they say, under my plan, 98.5% of Illinoisans will see a tax cut. And I say, well, that's great, but how are we solving any problems, right? Again, this is math and finance. We need money to solve problems, not less money, more money, right? And everyone acknowledges that. Three economists from the Federal Reserve at a recent pension summit in Chicago said, Illinois has to raise taxes. We think it should be a statewide property tax, but either way, you got to raise taxes, okay? S&P Global Services, Gabriel Pettit, one of the top guys in the country on this, said it's clear Illinois is going to have to raise taxes. Look, everyone acknowledges, everyone who's not running for office acknowledges that's the math of this situation. So the rate structure that I used when I was trying to do this, I tried to pick the most palatable rate structure. So I said there are rate structures where the rates start really low and go really high. California, Hawaii, Oregon start around 1, end around 14, 12 to 14, right? I picked the flattest rate structure of the graduated states, and I thought it was a good example. I picked the state of Wisconsin, where the rate started 4 and ended 7.65, relatively flat, right? So under that scenario, and if you run all these different scenarios, you get different amounts of money back from it. Mine would have raised $6 billion. $3 billion would have gone immediately into property tax relief, because that is a problem that every Illinoisan faces, is high property taxes. So through a property tax relief fund tied to K through 12 funding, we would have seen $3 billion historic property tax relief under my plan. I would have had actually some sales tax rate relief, because again, middle income people spend a lot of their money on sales taxes. And then finally, I would have had $1 billion a year. My plan was $1 billion, and this is very similar to what we talked about with bonding. The idea with the repayment of our pension debt is to front load it. So I said, let's take $1 billion a year, and whatever the payment is required on our pensions, let's add an additional $1 billion. So this year was $8.5 billion. We would have paid $9.5 billion. So I asked COGFA, what does it do if we put $1 billion a year extra in for the next 27 years? And you know what they told me? Well, first of all, you only have to do it for 20, because it lops 7 years off the ramp, and it saves you $60 billion. Okay? So 7 years off the ramp. So that means in 20 years, we go from a massive payment in our pensions to nothing. And we have a huge budget windfall, which, what do you do with all that money? Well, what do you want to do with all that money? Where do you want to spend it? Because the pensions are topped up. You know what one place is that you could spend it? And this is what I tell all of my friends who are opposed to the idea of this. You could spend it on a tax cut. Right? So you can have low taxes in Illinois. You just have to have a plan to get there. Just saying you want them, you 8.5. Remember I told you how we're going to 8.5? That's where we'll be. Okay? So this was a plan to get us there. I used the rates of the state of Wisconsin. If you used like Oregon's rates, you raise more money, right? So it depends on the state that you chose. I chose Wisconsin because of its proximity to us, about the fact that we have cross-border wars with. I said, let's make ourselves more like our neighbors. And Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota. I took all of those and I took the lowest rate structure. And it was more of a mathematical exercise to show what could be done. So that was what I did. Yes, sir.
As part of your solution, is it likely that retirees will have the income tax, and if so, what that look like?
So my solution did not call for it. And again, I was asked this question yesterday. And if we're honest, right? And if we listen to the people who tell us what the math is, a tax increase is an absolute necessity. So then the only question is, and this is what I say to my friends who say, but I'm not going to consider that idea. And I say, don't take any ideas off the table. Everything has to be on the table when you're looking at a $224 billion cumulative debt. And so obviously it's pretty clear that the only way we really can raise money is income taxes, property taxes, sales taxes, which could include either a rate increase or an expansion into services, which is often talked about. We could close corporate loopholes, but realistically speaking, there's not enough corporate loopholes to solve this problem. And then finally, realistically speaking, is retirement tax. So I think that at some point in our future, we're going to have to address that question. I really don't know what the temperature of or the will of the legislature will be. The reality of it is, I told a group yesterday, a young man asked me, he said, what's the chances that we'll get a retirement tax? And I said, well, it'll a lot more likely when 30 people under the age of 35 start voting, right? I mean, the political reality of it is, who votes? People who are senior citizens vote 100%. People under the age of 35 voted about 20%. So, you know, so it is something that's going to have to be on the table. I just honestly, it hasn't even really been talked about yet, but it'll have to be, you know, I refuse to take anything off the table when it comes to solving our financial problems. Anything else? Any other questions? Yes, ma'am?
The woman asked what we could do earlier and educate. I talk to people quite a bit. When the state problem is addressed, it's pointed that it's the pension problem and that you as individuals that draw pension are our enemy.
Yeah.
Okay?
That's
the
unfortunate.
reality of that. The other thing is the understanding of the different state pension systems. The state university retirement system does not pay into Social Security.
Right.
Some of our other state plans have a Social Security payment in addition to. So it's a two-part animal for them. And so for state university retirement system people, we often say, well, you can just live on your Social Security. And they don't understand that process. And sometimes I find that some of our legislators don't understand that.
Oh, yeah.
With that, so I would ask for your assistance as part of your role, that the pension systems are so different with that. Then the shifting back to universities in terms of doing the employee share. And I know they're doing math with that and looking at that, is that as we're trying to get increases in higher ed funding, we'll take it away.
With a cost shift, yeah.
With that remark. So there's a lot of complicated things, but I guess if you can help us in suggestions for educating, but also somehow getting it to tone down that those that are receiving pensions aren't your enemy and they're all different.
Right.
Will be helpful.
Yeah, I do my best with that in my role when I speak to people who immediately attack pensions, because of course there is a certain segment of our society who would have really liked if we could have just said, we're not giving you all your pension, we're giving you half now. They would have liked that. That would have benefited them. And so there are a lot of people who receive news that makes it seem like that's a good idea. I don't know how to tell you how to help me with that. I will tell you just a little anecdote. Sitting in one of those pension hearings before I was a member, one of my colleagues, so I don't want to name that person, Jeannie Ives, we were sitting there before a panel of state police officers. And Representative Ives pulled out a study, and she said, I have this study before me, and it says that the average state police officer receives a pension of, and I'm going to guess the numbers here, $68,000 a year. $68,000 a year. Now, I support first responders, but that's ridiculous. How can you sit there when the taxpayer is the one that's paying for your pension? How can you sit there and say that you're entitled to twice what they get under Social Security? And she really grilled them. As you know, she can get kind of worked up, right? And so I reached back and asked the chairman if I could ask a few questions. And so I said to the police officer, I said, how much do you contribute to your pension? And he said, 11.5%. I said, how much of your salary do you contribute to your pension? He said, 11.5%. I said, no. But how much do you, I mean, because I know the government picks up most of that, so how much do you pay out of your salary? How much is your contribution? He said, 11.5%, Representative. I said, so you pay 11.5% of your salary, and you think that entitles you to twice what the average Social Security recipient is getting, huh? And he said, well, it's just what's been promised. I said, Jack, what is the average person in private sector paying to Social Security? And he said, 6.2%. And I said, and yet still you think you're entitled to, you know? And so I try to use anecdotes like that. That is the way that I sort of, you know, people need to, and again, this is where you come in as educators. You understand this. When you find someone who criticizes your pension, explain it to them in a way that they can understand. You know. Any other questions before I leave you? No. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. Yeah. Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.